As we hear this gospel, I wonder how many of us think about it from Lazarus' point of view. Let's think about what happens here in this moment. Jesus cries out, "Lazarus, come out." I picture Lazarus in the tomb, all of a sudden hearing the voice of Jesus and thinking to himself, I just heard something. But wait a second, I'm dead. How did I just hear something? I'm sorry, he had to have been a little perplexed, because he had been dead for 4 days. He'd been in the tomb for 4 days. And yet he heard those words, "Lazarus, come out." And then he probably was like, well, I can move. So something is going on here. And then he starts probably to wiggle his toes and his fingers. And then he begins the process of getting up. And then he realizes there's a problem. I'm all wrapped up. Further proof that I was dead. They wouldn't have just put me in the tomb, wrapping me up if I was alive. What's happening here? But I heard his voice. I heard his voice. And his voice clearly was calling for me. What does this mean? How is this possible? Yet, I can hear. I can kind of see through the burial cloths. I can see that there's light coming from over here. I assume that's the way out. What do I do? Well, he told me to come out. So I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. Now, one of the things you got to also realize is a lot of times we see these pictures of the tombs where the tomb entrance is like as tall as I am. They're not. The time of Jesus, and it wasn't because they were shorter than back then. I mean, they were. But the tomb entrances were about 3 feet high. So not only does Lazarus have to come out, he has to crawl to get out of the tomb in the burial cloths. So I'm sure he's thinking as he comes to there, I'm kind of tied up right now. How do I do this? But he told me. I know what he told me to do. I'm going to do it. I'll make this work. Because it's a better option than where I was. And so he manages to get himself crawling through the hole, out. And how the crowd must have reacted to see this guy crawling out of the tomb. Just ask yourself how you would have felt in that moment. Do you see a dead man coming out of a tomb? And Jesus says those powerful words, "Untie him and let him go." Lent is the time for us to hear those words from Jesus. All of us, in our own ways, build our own tombs, whether we realize it or not. We create our tombs as we enter into the life of sin. As we put things before God, before others, before creation itself, and if we understood it correctly, even before ourselves. We create our tombs by the more and more the ways we come to distance ourselves from God. The ways that we decide that we know better than God does of how the world should run. That we know better than God does about what are our deepest needs and concerns. That we know better than God about, well, just pick your favorite subject that I think you probably know that you know better than God. And in that way, we come to also begin to bind ourselves in burial cloths. And it gets harder and harder to see the Lord and to hear him in our lives. It gets harder and harder to recognize what the truth is and the life that we should truly be living. As we roll the rock in front of the tomb to ensure that we're nice and safe, that our way of looking at the world is kept safe, that our understanding of the way life should be is not troubled in any way. And we simply lay down and die. Figuratively, obviously. Because we really stop living. Because the only way to truly live is to embrace Christ and his ways. To be willing to speak the words of Jesus that he does in the agony of the garden, not my will, but your will. To begin to see that life is not about what we think is right. It is not about our controlling our destiny and determining the life that we should be living, but rather giving it over to Christ. And Lent is our time to begin to understand that life, to begin to embrace the life that God has created for us, to become that person God has created us to be. But that is what it means to live. It is now, in this time, in this moment, to recognize that Christ is calling us out of the tomb. He's calling us back from death to life. And he is saying, come out. But will we hear his voice? Will we be like Lazarus, no matter how confused that we are? Will we hear his voice calling us? Will we recognize those powerful words? Untie the one I love and let them go. Jesus wants to untie you from all that is holding you in bondage, all that is holding you back. He wants you to begin to live life anew. That is the lesson of Lazarus. I have no doubt in that day he was confused and uncertain of what he was to do as he heard the voice of Jesus calling out to him. But know that Jesus is calling out to you today. And that is why he gives us the great gifts of the sacraments. The gift of the Eucharist to strengthen us when we are uncertain. The gift of confession that when we mess up, when we begin to enter into the tomb, when we begin to tie ourselves up, Jesus calls to us to come to be healed, that he may unbind us and help us to go free. That is the point of the sacrament of confession. It's not about feeling bad about our sins. It's about being set free by the love and mercy of our God. It is about destroying the tomb that we have created. And it is about beginning to live life anew. That day, Lazarus was confused, I have no doubt. But I also know he must have felt a sense of abiding joy as he heard those words of freedom. Come out, untie him, and let him go. May you know that Jesus is speaking those words to you today.